Photographer Nick Nichols went to document a very small and relatively unknown wildlife sanctuary in Chad called Zakoma. The original intent was to travel there and bring back a classic story of diverse species of an exotic locale, and that is what Nick did up to a point. This is a serval cat. He's actually taking his own picture, shot with what's called a camera trap. There's an infrared beam that's going across, and he stepped into the beam and taken his photograph. These are baboons at a watering hole. The camera, again, an automatic camera, took thousands of pictures of this, and Nick ended up with a lot of pictures of the rear ends of baboons. A lion having a late night snack. Notice he's got a broken tooth. And a crocodile walks up a riverbank towards its den. I love this little bit of water that comes off the back of his tail. But the centerpiece species of Zakoma are the elephants. It's one of the largest intact herds in this part of Africa. Here's a photograph shot in moonlight, something that digital photography has made a big difference for. It was with the elephants that this story pivoted. Nick, along with researcher Dr. Michael Fay, collared the matriarch of the herd. They named her Annie, and they began tracking her movements. The herd was safe within the confines of the park because of this dedicated group of park rangers. But once the annual rains began, the herd would begin migrating to feeding grounds outside the park, and that's when they ran into trouble. For outside the safety of the park were poachers who would hunt them down only for the value of their ivory tusks. The matriarch that they were radio tracking, after weeks of moving back and forth in and out of the park, came to a halt outside the park. Annie had been killed, along with 20 members of her herd, and they only came for the ivory. And this is actually one of the rangers. They were able to chase off one of the poachers and recover this ivory because they couldn't leave it there because it's still valuable. But what Nick did was he brought back was a story that went beyond the old school method of just straight, isn't this an amazing world? And instead created a story that touched our audiences deeply. Instead of just knowledge of this park, he created an understanding and an empathy for the elephants, the rangers, and the many issues surrounding human-wildlife conflicts. Now let's go over to India. Sometimes you can tell a broad story in a focused way. We were looking at the same issue that Richard Werman touches upon in his New World Population Project. For the first time in history, more people live in urban rather than rural environs. And most of that growth is not in the cities, but in the slums that surround them. Jonas Bendixson, a very energetic photographer, came to me and said, we need to document this, and here's my proposal. Let's go all over the world and photograph every single slum around the world. And I said, well, that might be a bit ambitious for our budget. So instead, what we did was we decided to, instead of going out and doing what would result in what we consider sort of a survey story, where you just go in and see just a little bit of everything, we put Jonas into Dharavi, which is part of Mumbai, India, and let him stay there and really get into the heart and soul of this really major part of the city. What Jonas did was not just go and do a surface look at the awful conditions that exist in such places. He saw that this was a living and breathing and vital part of how the entire urban area functioned. By staying tightly focused in one place, Jonas tapped in to the soul and the enduring human spirit that underlies this community. And he did it in a beautiful way. Sometimes, though, the only way to tell a story is with the sweeping picture. We teamed up underwater photographer Brian Scarry and photojournalist Randy Olson to document the depletion of the world's fisheries. We weren't the only ones to tackle this subject, but the photographs that Brian and Randy created are among the best to capture both the human and natural devastation of overfishing. Here in a photo by Brian, a seemingly crucified shark is caught up in a gill net off of Baja. I've seen sort of okay pictures of bycatch, the animals accidentally scooped up while fishing for a specific species. But here, Brian captured a unique view by positioning himself underneath the boat when they threw the waste overboard. And Brian then went on to even greater risk to get this never-before-made photograph of a trawl net scraping the ocean bottom. Back on land, Randy Olson photographed a makeshift fish market in Africa where the remains of filleted fish were sold to the locals, the main parts having already been sent to Europe. And here in China, Randy shot a jellyfish market. As prime food sources are depleted, the harvest goes deeper into the oceans and brings in more such sources of protein. This is called fishing down the food chain. But there are also glimmers of hope. And I think anytime we're doing a big story on this, we don't really want to go and just look at all the problems. We also want to look for solutions. And Brian photographed a marine sanctuary in New Zealand where commercial fishing had been banned, the result being that the overfished species have been restored, and with them a possible solution for sustainable fisheries. Photography can also compel us to confront issues that are potentially distressing and controversial. James Knockway, who was honored last year at last year's TED, took a look at the sweep of the medical system that is utilized to handle the American wounded coming out of Iraq. It is like a tube where a wounded soldier enters on one end and exits back home on the other. Jim started in the battlefield. Here, a medical technician tends to a wounded soldier on the helicopter ride back to the field hospital. Here is in the field hospital. The soldier on the right has the name of his daughter tattooed across his chest as a reminder of home. From here, the more severely wounded are transported back to Germany, where they meet up with their families for the first time. And then back to the States to recuperate at veterans' hospitals such as here in Walter Reed. And finally, often fitted with high-tech prosthesis, they exit the medical system and attempt to regain their pre-war lives. Jim took what could have been a straight-up medical science story and gave it a human dimension that touched our readers deeply. Now, these stories are great examples of how photography can be used to address some of our most important topics. But there are also times when photographers simply encounter things that are, when it comes down to it, just plain fun. Photographer Paul Nicklin traveled to Antarctica to shoot a story on leopard seals. They have been rarely photographed, partly because they are considered one of the most dangerous predators in the ocean. In fact, a year earlier, a researcher had been grabbed by one and pulled down to depth and killed. So you can imagine Paul was maybe a little bit hesitant about getting into the water. Now, what leopard seals do mostly is they eat penguins. You know of the march of the penguins? This is sort of the munch of the penguins. Here a penguin goes up to the edge and looks out to see if the coast is clear, and then everybody kind of runs out and goes out. But then Paul got in the water, and he said he was never really afraid of this. This one female came up to him. She's probably, and it's a shame you can't see it in the photograph, but she's 12 feet long. So she is pretty significant in size. And Paul said he was never really afraid because she was more curious about him than threatened. This mouthing behavior on the right was really her way of saying to him, hey, look how big I am, or, my, what big teeth you have. Then Paul thinks that she simply took pity on him. To her, here was this big, goofy creature in the water that for some reason didn't seem to be interested in chasing penguins. So what she did was she started to bring penguins to him alive and put them in front of him. She dropped them off, and then they would swim away. She'd kind of look at him, go, what are you doing? Go back and get them, and then bring them back and drop them in front of him. And she did this for over the course of a couple of days, until the point where she got so frustrated with him that she started putting them directly on top of his head, which just resulted in a fantastic photograph. Eventually, though, Paul thinks that she just figured that he was never going to survive. This is her kind of just puffing out, snorting out in sort of disgust, and lost interest with him and went back to what she does best. Paul set out to photograph a relatively mysterious and unknown creature and came back with not just a collection of photographs, but an amazing experience and a great story. It is these kinds of stories, ones that go beyond the immediate or just the superficial, that demonstrate the power of photojournalism. I believe that photography can make a real connection to people and can be employed as a positive agent for understanding the challenges and opportunities facing our world today. Thank you.